Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, we'd like to welcome you to today's Resource Adequacy Modeling and Program Design Working Group meeting to discuss the draft final proposal follow-up for Track 1. Just a reminder, this call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Please remember to keep your comments professional and respectful today. We welcome and look forward to your engagement and participation in today's meeting. And just a side note today, we are conducting this meeting from a conference room at the CAISO headquarters, and we're going to be doing a fire drill in our building today. So there may be a noise that goes off at some point for 30 seconds. For those of you online today, we have new instructions for raising your hand. The raise hand icon is now directly at the bottom of your WebEx screen. If you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. There's also a new Inteller transparency view at the bottom right to see other attendees on the call. Be sure to refresh it prior to viewing. And closed captioning is also now available by clicking the CC button on the bottom left of your screen. Please remember to state your name and affiliation first before making a comment. And you can also send your comments and questions via chat to all panelists or to myself directly. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer in Teller Events. Today's agenda, we're going to begin with a brief meeting purpose slide, and then after that, we're going to go into the RAMPD Track 1 draft final proposal. I'm joined here by Ansel Lundberg, Mark Kutstra, and Aditya, and also Partha Malvadkar is joining us online. And just a note for the RAMPD Track 1 draft final proposal for each topic, comment review will be followed by proposal overview. So with that, I'll turn things over to Partha Malvadkar.
No, thank you, Christina, and yeah, thanks everybody. Really appreciate the everybody who's joining us today. Just in terms of sort of level setting on the purpose of today's meeting, the first purpose that we want to do is we really say first thank you. I really appreciate everyone's good and thoughtful comments in terms of our Track 1 default proposal. We wanted to take some time to make sure that we fully understood stakeholders' perspectives and that you all understood where each other were coming from in terms of your feedback to our Track 1 default design. Sort of the second purpose of today's meeting is really to address some of those comments and feedback. And some of them stakeholders are looking for some clarifications in terms of some of the design details, and so we're going to take some time to provide those clarifications. Also, we're thinking about, we're wanting to sort of preview with you all some potential proposed changes to the August 25th draft file proposal, and to get some discussion around sort of the pros and cons of those changes, which are really seeking to address some of the feedback we heard both at the last meeting as well as in the comments. So maybe I'll just pause there, and before I turn it back over to Ansel, Mark, and Aditya, we can maybe see if there's any questions to kick us off in terms of the purpose of today's meeting.
Not seeing any questions at this time.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you again. Yeah, really appreciate everybody. Look forward to a good, robust discussion today. And yeah, with that, I'll kick it back to you, Ansel.
All right. Partha, everyone, this is Ansel. Give us a moment here. Start us off here with a couple level set items where we are in the process. Reminder, policy objective, track 1, guiding the development. Tariff should reflect.
What?
Oh, do we need a new mic?
I see a comment online. You're breaking up really bad on my end. I saw
Okay.
some other activity indicate as much.
Thank you for getting that out of the way. How's this?
That
Better?
sounds much better.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. All right. Yeah, please let us know if there's any other audio challenges. So just to level set, what we have on the screen here is the policy objectives for resource adequacy modeling and program design track 1. And these objectives have guided us since the issue paper, and they were developed coming out of the working group process from 2023 and 2024. They include the counting rules that are included in the CAISO tariff should reflect the relative contribution of different resource types and individual resources to maintain balancing authority area-wide and local reliability. Also include an objective that the PRM methodology in the tariff should be designed alongside such counting rules to create a coherent set of RA standards. And so the final objective is if these standards were adopted by all local regulatory authorities within the BAA, the resulting compliant load serving entity capacity portfolios could reasonably be expected to meet at least a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation. So just revisiting those as we go through the proposal as it stands today. Just to check in on the timeline, we're still in process for meeting the roadmap that was shared at the end of last year for a decision on track 1 by the end of this year, which means sharing this proposal with the Board of Governors of CAISO for approval in October. All right. So just to review again, let's discuss what is in the track 1 proposal as it stands today. And this applies to both the draft final proposal that was posted in August, as well as where we're moving today. This is also touching on how this proposal is connected with other tracks in the RA modeling and program design initiative. So what the proposal includes is updates to the default qualifying capacity methodology and default planning reserve margin that are currently in the California ISO tariff in section 40. And these are to be used only when a local regulatory authority does not provide a methodology for QC or reserve margin. This has never taken place since these provisions were put in place. The default counting rules in the tariff or the QC methodology do not impact the net qualifying capacity of a resource. This is, of course, unless a local regulatory authority chooses to adopt the QC methodology. And finally, just a reminder that the unforced capacity UCAP mechanism in track 1 proposal is not proposed as an additional D-rate to the NQC value that is established by the local regulatory authority. So just there may have been some confusion. In June, there was a proposal in track 1, in the straw proposal, that included a change to the NQC process based on ambient D rates. That is no longer included. What I will note on the second section here is that the track 1 proposal and the design of the default PRM and QC methodology do not change the policy proposed in other tracks, track 2 or 3A or 3B. And the UCAP methodology, similar to comment above, is only for CAISO's default counting rules and reserve margin, and does not have a linkage with the must offer obligations that are set forth by CAISO, the RA availability incentive mechanism, or any other topics being discussed in track 2. So just setting out our scope here. All right. A quick overview of where we were in the August proposal that we discussed at our workshop a few weeks ago, and then some changes and clarifications that we applied since then, and we will be proposing and discussing those changes today, and then also covering what will remain the same. Give me one moment to check in the room here.
We have 2 questions. First, we have Paul Nelson. Stacy, if you could please unmute Paul Nelson. Stacy, if you could please unmute Paul.
Hi,
There we go.
this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. Could you go back one slide? Oh, sorry, we're on the right side. Never mind.
Okay, great.
The first bullet, second sub-bullet, could you clarify that? Because I'm not sure what that means. Default county rules do not impact NQC unless LRA chooses to adopt a QC methodology.
Yes, so hoping to dispel any confusion here, the default counting rules only apply if the CPUC, local regulatory authority, or other federal agency has not established any QC criteria, or if they choose to rely on the criteria in the CAISO tariff. And only in these cases will the provisions of section 40.8 today apply. So what this means is, and what I'm trying to get across in this bullet is the changes that we have proposed in this in the draft final proposal do not impact the NQC process in any way. But the parenthetical here is indicating that it is always under the local regulatory authority jurisdiction to set their own QC methodology and reserve margin. And so that is always their ability and their prerogative.
Okay, so let me just repeat back my understanding. So the NQC, the net process where you look at deliverability is unchanged.
Correct.
So if the LRA adopts a QC methodology, you'll still do the net processing of deliverability. If they don't adopt a QC methodology, these default rules would apply, and you'd still apply a similar net deliverability approach. Okay.
Exactly.
One question I have, and it's not quite directly this, I want to understand, especially when we discuss when UCAP is utilized, does that become the defined qualifying capacity to be used in the CAISO tariff? And the reason, let me bring up the example that I want to discuss is today you have, let's just assume the net and the qualifying capacity is the same, it's 100 megawatts. You've got a 5% forced outage rate. So the UCAP value would be 95 megawatts. Is the QC now for that thermal resource 95 megawatts? And I'm going to have to bring up, then would the must offer be 95 megawatts? Or would it be 100 megawatts if they're not on forced outage?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So I think first I want to the first part of your question. Well, let me hit the second part first. So just pointing to the final bullet on this page, there's no change to the must offer obligations that are currently in the CAISO tariff. And for resources that would be subject to UCAP under the default counting rules, if an LRA so chooses, that would, the must offer rules would remain, which are based on shown resource adequacy. And just to step back a little bit, I would mention just that we focus on the default rules. CAISO has various default provisions in the tariff beyond QC methodology or metering requirements, other things that serve as a fallback mechanism in the case that a local regulatory authority has not indicated their own rule set. So I think this is only, your question applies generally based on what a local regulatory authority chooses to set for their own QC methodology. And maybe I'll pass it to Partha here.
Yeah, and I think that last part, what Ansel said, Paul, is maybe the key part of, I think we recognize the fact that we might have to have more discussions, particularly as, you know, the CPUC moves forward with their own UCAP methodology that's applied, of what are all the implications to the move, to unavailability, and what should be like the basis. I think that there's from our own internal discussions, I think there's probably some cases where it's probably clear line in terms of what the must offer obligation should be associated with this counting methodology. There's probably some nuanced examples for where, for example, if it's subject to an ambient D rate, should there be sort of a further penalty via, RAIM or the RAIM replacement that's applied on top of that, based on sort of that full capacity value. So I think there's some shades of gray that'll probably need to have more discussion in track 2 in terms of what those full implications are. But as Ansel alluded to, these are really just the default values here. I think that broader conversation is probably more applicable to once the PUC program, once the PUC adopts UCAP, where are all the implications of that to the interfaces with the ISO's program and design. But I don't know, Paul, if you have any feedback or comments, love just to hear it.
Yeah, it's bringing up, one of the to-do tasks in the CPUC process on UCAP is to better understand its application. Is when do we use the existing QC definition for certain things, and then for UCAP, what is it appropriate for? It may not redefine what the current QC definition is. There may be, we still may have this current QC definition, and then we have this other UCAP number to be used for these purposes. And it's something that we need to look at and better understand within the CPUC processes. And I think, as you mentioned, I think this will also come up. I think you internally also need to kind of look at this as well as sort of the CAISO processes. So, yeah, there's more discussion to be had. Thank you, Partha.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Definitely agree.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Next in the queue, we have a question from Adeline Lesors. Go ahead, Adeline.
I think my question is also on this second bullet of the last paragraph, that there is no linkage with the most offer obligation, RAIM. I believe whether you apply a UCAP approach, whether it's for the default or if, as Paul mentioned, the CPUC is applying that, there are way more impact and discussion needed on the most offer obligation and RAIM. So I understand that you don't want to address that because it's track 1, and track 1 for you is the default. However, and my question is, so if some LRAs apply the default QC and apply the UCAP counting methodology you propose, what will be the most offer obligation and RAIM impact for these resources? And I think we discussed maybe 1 year ago that there would be many interdependencies between the tracks. That was something that was identified as a key, especially between the track 1 and track 2. And it's still very unclear to me what you mean with that.
You mind if I take a crack at it, Ansel?
Go for it.
Yeah, so thanks, Alan. I think that, at least there was part of there's been a number of iterations in terms of it. And as Ansel alluded to before, within the working group structure, there was probably some question around, would a CAISO UCAP design be applied just as a default in the case where LRAs chooses to use it or not, or would be just a haircut via a CAISO process automatically applied? Particularly because we're adopting this really only as a default. To really there's a linkage, it'll probably really need to be with what the PUC and other LRAs ultimately adopt. So I think we recognize the fact that if the PUC, assuming they continue to go down the path of UCAP and adopt that, if other LRAs adopt, UCAP or other similar message, we might need to think about how to revise RAIM, how the MOOs will work in regards to those program design choices that the LRAs are making. But I think that assuming that everyone's going to adopt our default and that we're going to be designing RAIM and designing everything else, assuming everyone is going to adopt the default, I don't think that's a reasonable assumption at this time. So I think it probably be more of we'll need to continue to work with stakeholders, with the LRAs, to ensure that whatever rules we come up with, particularly in terms of like the revised available incentive mechanisms, work well with their evolving designs. And so it's not really about working well with our defaults. It's really about working well with, the evolving designs, and in particular the PUC's evolving UCAP design. So
I think part that there are also like something important to bring back. I think when we started this initiative with working group, we were defining some problem statement. One of the problem statement we defined back in, 1 year ago, was actually the RAIM is not working. Kaiser was showing that there was a higher forced outage rate observed over the past years, and that was one of the reasons why we wanted to tackle how to provide the right incentive for generators to be available and to not be on forced outage. So I think with this bullet, you are actually completely missing that point, and I think that's the main problem we have at PG&E with this proposal. So that's definitely the reason why in the comments we submitted on Friday, we're asking you the UCAP portion and the implication that UCAP will have, because they will have impact on most of our obligation RAIM, whether it's default or it's like CPUC approved at the end. And that is definitely problematic. I think we're also changing the objectives that we defined previously. So that's really, I really encourage Kaiser to keep that in mind and not, and not write this down, because if there is no linkage, then we won't be doing any change on RAIM, and maybe the initiative is done, right?
Oh, just to be clear too, I think we are fully part of track 2 is still scoped to be RAIM replacement. And so I don't think that we're changing any of the intent or purpose of that design in track 2. I just think we're recognizing the fact that we're not necessarily going to have a standardized UCAP methodology that's being applied by all the different LRAs. And that was also via the feedback of stakeholders. And so I don't think the goals have changed at all. It's just that we're going to have to be working incrementally in that track to address how can we make sure that our available incentive mechanism works effectively in achieving the goals, recognizing the different LRA program designs, including if they're adopting UCAP type measures. So I don't think that we're changing the goals at all. It's just a matter of what the sequencing is of those processes, because we don't, we're not going to have certainty. We don't have certainty at this moment in time in terms of how those are going to exactly evolve. So I don't think that we're, but no, thank you, Ellen. Appreciate it.
I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
All right. So I'll just provide an overview here of the potential modifications that CAISO is considering to the draft final proposal that was shared in August, and then indicating what's going to remain the same under our current changes, and then I'll review a couple comments on the qualifying capacity process for local regulatory authorities, and then we can get into the overview of the proposal. So just to highlight, these are some top line items, and we'll go through each of these in more detail. So some changes that we're considering based on comments are a change to the assessment hours under the default UCAP counting methodology. And supply cushion hours are instead going to be focused only on at-risk hours, which are defined and informed by the loss of load expectation modeling. We heard a lot of comments in the workshop and in the written comments about issues that stakeholders raised with the supply cushion equation, and so we've tried to adapt based on those inputs. Additionally, the UCAP methodology in the default rules is focused now on, or remains focused on measuring resource availability, and so we have a revised list of natures of work, which includes all natures of work, to calculate the forced outage rate for UCAP except for transmission induced or a concept of force majeure. And then also noting on hydroelectric QC default methodology, there's going to be a separate allocation of the class average dispatchable hydro ELCC value between run of river and dispatchable, as well as a change to the adjustment factor for dispatchable hydro, which will now be based on forced outage rates instead of the previous proposal, which looked at generation during peak conditions. And then what's going to remain the same is, of course, the narrow focus of this proposal, which is default qualifying capacity methodologies and default planning reserve margin, as well as the participating load default QC methodology will continue to remain as is in the tariff today, which is based on average historic load reduction. And then what also remains is that these rules in section 40.8 have only been used if a local regulatory authority has not provided methodology, as I mentioned earlier, which has not taken place in the past. And LRAs maintain full jurisdiction over QC methodology and planning reserve margin. Okay, so a few overview comments from what we received on the August proposal that I wanted to touch on, and then I'll hand it to Mark Kutstra to review the proposal at a high level. So we had a comment from the California Public Utilities Commission Office of the Ratepayer Advocate, Cal Advocates, indicating CAISO should continue to conduct RA deficiency backstop procurement based on the RA requirements and RA showings of the constituent local regulatory authorities. And the Department of Water Resources also asked if the NQC values for RA showings will be different. For example, today's NQC values for the compliance year are updated or can be updated on a regular basis by LRAs and posted separately. So to answer these comments, LRAs still retain the ability to set the individual resource qualifying capacity values as today, and the NQC process remains unchanged with this policy, which includes the backstop procurement process, which is based on shown RA. We have a few more comments, and then I want to make sure that we have a chance for the commenters that we've highlighted to speak additionally to these comments if necessary. So 6 cities wrote the closure of the CAISO study window in August, as explained in the proposal, may result in an unreasonably narrow window available to load serving entities to meet increased requirements. So in response to this, just indicating that LRAs, of course, retain the ability to update their individual resource QC values on a monthly basis. And then in the annual process, the loss of load study in the summer assessment is required to be performed before providing updated default QC values and updating the PRM. Recognizing the process or the timing challenges that 6 cities highlighted, the default QC values will be provided to LRAs in advance of finalizing the NQC list in late summer. So it may be a narrow window, but we do intend to make that timing sequential. And then Department of Water Resources suggests the capacity forecasted for generating based on current hydrology as provided by the resource in the latest round of forecast as close to the month as possible would be a better, more accurate option than historical values. So again, the first response, the LRAs retain the ability to update the individual QC values on a monthly basis. And there is also I believe DWR's comment was on participating load resources, but we have a slight change to hydro resource study that will be highlighted later in the ELCC section. And finally, Association of Retail Energy Markets indicated currently CAISO uses the largest value reported by an LRA in performing resource counting if there are conflicting values. This practice does not reflect CAISO's assessment of the contribution of that resource to providing reliability services as CAISO models in setting its default QC values. So in response to that, and this is a topic we have heard from stakeholders on in the past in track 1, multiple conflicting LRA qualifying capacity values is a rare occurrence, and addressing or changing this policy is not scoped into track 1. However, it can be considered for future policy initiative. All right, so now I'll hand it to Mark Kutstra, and we can review the proposal as it stands.
We did just get a question. Did you want to take a moment?
Yes.
We have a hand raised from Carl Dunkel Werner. Go ahead, Carl.
I was just hoping to potentially clarify this comment here. I think we were.
Carl, could you please say what organization you're representing as well?
This is Carl from Cal Advocates.
Thanks.
I wanted to clarify our comment a little bit here. The concern was a little bit less the NQC process and more how CAISO would potentially do any future backstop procurement or anything like that, particularly in the context of the choice to model LOLE events as entering EEA watch. So just wanted to mention that for clarity, no need to sort of spend more time on this. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl. We appreciated the comments from Cal Advocates.
We're trying to progress the slides. Forgive us. So slide 14. Okay. Slide 14, this table is really the proposed methodology we're going to use for different types of technologies, how they're reported to us as dispatchable or not dispatchable. There's been no meaningful change to this, except for the changes we already noted about UCAP looking a little different for which hours we're looking at. We did also add participating load as a resource type here. And we want to emphasize right now the proposed methodology is to continue to rely on what's in the tariff. So what we're looking at providing and on a regular basis is at this table here. So this says everything except for the participating load, which is currently not changing in the tariff as proposed. But this is what we're looking at providing for each individual resource, what method we're using. So for thermal resources, both renewable and fossil fuel that are dispatchable, nuclear and pumped hydro, we're looking at using a UCAP with seasonal values. Seasons are summer being May through October, and then winter being November through April, and the granularity is a unit-specific calculation. For thermal and renewable thermal resources, not including solar thermal, that are reported to us as not dispatchable. These resources are proposed to be accredited through a monthly average generation, and so it'll be a monthly value, and it'll also use a unit-specific calculation. For the supply side demand response, this is going to be a performance rating. It will be an annual value, and we're looking at the DR provider level calculation. For the remaining resources, we're looking at ELCC values. This would be for battery storage, all hydro, wind, and solar. And then we'll be having monthly values for those resources as well. So we'll be using an average ELCC, but then for battery storage and dispatchable hydro, we'll portion out those ELCC values using availability or their forced outage rates. And then For run-of-river hydro, wind, and solar, including solar thermal, will be apportioning out the ELCC values based off of their performance during critical hours or at-risk hours. Oh, yep.
Few hands raised. First, we have Perry Servedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Perry Servideo, CISA. We saw a discussion in the comments that came in on this related to this difference in treatment between pumped hydro and say, I guess where a long duration energy storage resource would fall in under battery storage, which I think is what you said on the last call. And I was just wondering if you could maybe address some of that, some of those comments here. Basically, to us, when you look at an ELCC, it's basically all about duration. So a longer duration battery storage technically should have a higher ELCC, but I'm also seeing pumped hydro as basically like a long duration of some varying duration asset here that's under the UCAP method. Can you maybe just speak to this difference in treatment between these two, and if there's any room for getting some alignment there?
Yes. Right now, all the battery storage we're looking at in our ELCCs, we're assuming a 4-hour duration. You have this flagged forward here. To look at the long duration storage and develop a methodology for really accounting for that duration. So we want to be able to incorporate that right now. It does exist as a situation on the system because we do have almost 700 megawatts of storage with exceeding 5 hours, at or exceeding about 5 hours. But it is relatively small compared to the total storage as well. So we do acknowledge that it's something there that we do want to start looking.
How does that compare to the megawatts of pumped hydro on the system?
Don't recall offhand. I think there's a couple thousand megawatts of pumped hydro, but they're all also very unique. Have other considerations as well that we would need to dig into a little bit differently than the long duration energy storage. But that is something we're open to looking at and improving in the future.
Yeah, I would say we agree with the comments that are out there that we should be trying to seek alignment on some basis between these two, just so that as procurement entities are weighing the RA value trade-off between a long duration energy storage battery and a long duration pumped hydro facility, they're making that those trade-offs correctly in the bilateral RA market. So I definitely support keeping that as a topic to pursue further. And I'll also note, we're already up to, you said, about 700 megawatts of greater than 5 hour, and a lot more is coming based on the procurement orders. So this is a pretty timely topic. I think you might have more joining next year, but I think you're going to see the floodgates open, so to speak, in 27 and 28.
Thank you, Perry.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Colin Smith. Go ahead, Colin.
I wanted to ask about the supply side demand response performance-based UCAP methodology, and specifically how that intersects with the plan to basically apply the LRA's specific QC methodology, if there is one. Because supply side demand response resources already have their QCs calibrated by the load impact protocol process, where the CPUC determines based on historic performance what QC or NQC is allocated to each supply side demand response provider. And they also have the ability to further derate a resources or a provider's resources based on performance the previous quarter or the same quarter of the previous year. Would this qualify as a separate QC methodology under the the relevant LRA, and therefore would be used in place of a supply side DR performance UCAP methodology established here?
Yeah, so if another LRA has a methodology for supply side DR and they submit that to us, these default rules would not come into play at all. Does that answer your question, Colin?
Will you please unmute Colin one more time?
This is Ansel. I'll add also that we have a section with more information about the performance factor and application later in the deck. So we can get into this in a little more depth.
Got it. I think that does answer my question. I'm happy to get into this more later in the presentation. Just to clarify, basically what you're saying is the LRA, i.e. the CPUC, would need to submit this methodology to CAISO, and it would be used over the performance-based UCAP that would be established here.
Correct. And I'll just emphasize for completeness, that's true for all of these methodologies and approaches that we have as our default. An LRA is submitting QC values for a resource. We would not be applying these default methodologies to that resource.
And so that includes the load impact protocol from the CPUC or any QC methodology.
Colin, next we have a question from Paul Nelson. Go ahead, Paul.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with the CPUC Energy Division. I think in a prior proposal for battery storage, you were going to use UCAP, and so you're moving that to ELCC. Is that correct?
The batteries have been under ELCC for a while now, but yes, at one point we were considering UCAP for battery storage.
Okay.
But that's shifted, I think, since June.
Correct.
Yeah.
Can you, because the CPUC, we're looking at using UCAP for battery storage. So can you shed some light on why you think ELCC is a superior approach than UCAP?
It comes down to the differences in our overall methodologies and how the programs work. For the slice a day at the CPUC, you guys are using UCAP or proposing to use UCAP, but you also have a charging sufficiency across the 24 hours. Since we don't have that charging sufficiency across 24 hours, a UCAP for batteries doesn't capture the duration limitations that battery storage has. And ELCC does capture that when you're looking at a single point value, because you're looking at what the resource can be reasonably expected to provide across a wide range of possibilities. And so an ELCC will actually capture that storage duration limitations along with outage limitations that can't otherwise be captured in a single point program with just UCAP. So it comes down not necessarily to the difference in how we view storage, but it's the difference in the program as a whole.
Okay, thank you. That was helpful.
Next in the queue, we have Mohan Nirula. Go ahead, Mohan. We'll mute it if you're speaking now, Mohan. Lost audio. We'll circle back to you once you can fix your audio. If you want to type your question in the chat as well, we can read it out to you. And I'm not seeing any further questions at this time.
So some things that we've identified for future improvements, and this does follow out of conversations we've had with stakeholders, through our public meetings, as well as just how we've moved through this. We are wanting to better continue to update our hydrological conditions and the impact that that has on ELCCs. The ELCCs we've done so far have been for average hydro conditions, but we all know that changes from year to year. We want to be able to capture that. Long duration storage, as we discussed earlier, we do want to develop a methodology that takes into account different storage limitations, make sure that that's accurately reflected. As we noted, we are aware that there are almost 700 megawatts of storage on the system that has 5 or more integration. So this is something that we do want to take seriously. Also more coming online in the near future. It is something we would like to address, but we have not addressed that in these numbers right now. And then we also do want to continue to look at the default rules for UCAP methodologies, and continue to refine that, especially as the CPUC moves towards adopting UCAP methodology. We will hopefully be able to revisit what we have in our UCAP once the CPUC has adopted theirs, but we don't want to continue having 2 sets of discussions, because we have 2 processes that are doing something similar. I will pass it back for slides.
Thank you, Mark. So there were a few comments on the annual process that was included to develop the loss of load study and the default QC values and PRM. So just wanted to highlight these. There was a comment from California Energy Storage Association indicating that they support a proposal being updated to commit the CAISO to performing a process at least annually involving robust stakeholder input to establish the default QC methodology and values and PRM to achieve the industry standard 1 in 10 LOLE. And this indicating again that this annual process and a requirement to seek stakeholder input and review before finalization must be added to the tariff. They also, CISA also indicated that the proposal must be updated to commit CAISO to performing an annual assessment to determine if the existing LRA-RA programs are delivering sufficient capacity to meet this 1 in 10 standard. And a comment about CAISO studies demonstrating that existing RA programs are often not delivering sufficient capacity to meet this standard. So just acknowledging these comments. The first comment, we spoke to this at the August workshop. The process obviously is included in the draft final proposal and is indicated as a part of that. This is not, the tariff process will follow, as we'll touch on in the next slide. And so we welcome stakeholder input as we move forward through this process. And on the second comment, referring to the study that was performed last, I believe it was about a year ago in the working group, where there was an assessment of different portfolios, including all resources and shown RA or requirements. And then there was also a stack analysis of previous showings to revisit that assessment that was shared early at the beginning of this year. So acknowledging that CAISO has performed this assessment in the past, and we appreciate the comments in support of this going forward. All right, so just to touch on that, the next steps as included in the proposal. So as I mentioned, based on the roadmap, the proposal will be presented at the Board of Governors meeting in October, and we will post a final proposal shortly. And then the tariff and business practice manuals language development will follow, as well as the filing by CAISO at FERC. And then the annual process that is described in the proposal will kick off at that time, starting with the summer assessment for next year. Before we move on to the analytical approach, I think we could take a comment.
Hand raised by Perry. Go ahead, Perry.
Perry Servideo, CISA, thanks for this response. I just wanted to, I think what I'm hearing is that we'll work that out in the tariff drafting sort of part of the process. I think the key point on this first comment that we have, though, is the policy to perform this process at least annually. I think that's the key thing that we flagged as being missing within the draft final proposal. So if the policy is at least annually, I think you've mostly satisfied this first one, but we'd also like to see that the goal is really to achieve an industry standard 0.1 LOLE. I think if you nail down those two sort of policy objectives that would have to make their way into the tariff, I think you've satisfied this first one.
Thank you for the comments, Perry.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Well, I didn't get an answer. Is the policy to perform the process at least annually?
So there's an annual process proposed in the paper, and I see the distinction you're making, which is, will it be performed each year? So I think we hear the comments in support of doing that each year, and with the recognition that the summer assessment already takes place annually.
Yeah, Perry, this is Aditya. I think as new resource types or attributes are introduced, we will have to revisit and adjust our counting methodology. The plan is to do that during an annual review process with stakeholders. The extent of the annual review, maybe not every year we will have an opportunity to completely discuss the methodology in full detail, but it'll be refreshed values on an annual basis for sure. But then we will explore the need to update some stuff that needs to happen. So yeah, it will be annually reviewed and updated.
Mm-hmm. And then is the policy on that annual review? So just want to confirm
Yes,
that
it will
that
be in
it's
the
proposed to
policy.
at least be done annually.
Yes.
And then just some clarity around that process, that it will involve stakeholder input before A, the methodology is finalized, and B, before the resulting values are finalized. What I'm after mainly is this robust stakeholder input within that process.
Yep, that will be there. The finer point I would like to emphasize is maybe the methodology discussion may not be up for discussion every year, but all of this will be done in the stakeholder process.
Okay. I think that with anything, look, this is a big deal that we're moving the methodology essentially out of the tariff. So I just would like to stress that it will be very important that the tariff outline the goals and objectives of the methodology so that we have some yardstick to measure whether whatever happens in this annual process is meeting the need. So the tariff should just be very clear on the goals and objectives and principles for the process, so that when we do get the stakeholder input and review, we can measure that against some standard of review.
Agreed. Thanks, Perry.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any further questions at this time.
All right, so now I'll hand it back to Mark well, before I hand it to Mark, let's touch on a few more comments, because we did get some comments on the model calibration. So I have 2 pages here. We heard from CalCCA indicating that the CAISO should consider the cost implications when weighing advantages and disadvantages of choosing alternative event distributions. So this is in reference to the summer assessment loss of load event distributions across the year, and how those will be applied to developing monthly planning reserve margins. Similarly, Cal advocates indicated that CAISO should evaluate the cost implications of their translation from annual LOLE to monthly requirements, as well as indicating that the modeling improvements the CAISO should make include considering 2 important factors: what distribution of PRM values achieves the target annual LOLE at the lowest cost, and to what extent is the limited number of samples driving the results. So just to respond to this, the determinations of how the event distribution is spread across the year will be informed by the risk periods observed in the summer assessment modeling. And CAISO did share two alternatives for event distribution, one directly informed by the summer assessment as exactly as the events fall per month, and one that was described as smoothed to distribute them across additional months. And so what we heard from stakeholders and what we will be moving forward with is that we will consider the distribution as to be informed by the summer assessment and retain the ability to consider how that should all fit together. So a few other comments on this. Cal CCA indicated that CAISO should be explicit that the default PRM adopted is in no way relevant to any other planning reserve margin that applies to any other accounting methodology. And then the Association of Retail Energy Markets indicated CAISO's methodology for monthly model calibration should account for capacity required to meet local RA requirements. So on the first point, Cal CTA is correct. In keeping with CAISO and working group objectives, the proposed default methodologies and PRM have been designed as a holistic set of rules for a program, and there is no direct relevance to other PRMs developed by other entities. And on the second point, regarding monthly calibration approach that CAISO has proposed using gas plants to be added and removed, CAISO will evaluate the potential impact of this methodology and consider alternative methods if necessary. We spoke of this at the previous workshop in August and heard from stakeholders about this as well. I think the removal of a specific power plant, gas plant over another should have negligible impact on the model results. But we understand the concerns regarding local resource adequacy requirements and resources in local areas.
Sure. Just to expand on what Ansel said about removing one plant over another shouldn't have a significant impact, or it should only have a negligible impact on the results. And that's because we have a zonal model that doesn't distinguish between those local areas. So if we're pulling out 5,000 megawatts of gas, it shouldn't really matter which 5,000 we pull out for the model results. That being said, we do want to take a look, or more detailed look, at how respecting those local capacity requirements or local area capacity requirements could impact overall results, especially if it changes how we do full calibration.
Thanks, Mark. All right. Wanted to make sure we get a chance to hear from any of these comments that we highlighted or any thoughts on this. Tina?
Raised from Andrew Mills. Go ahead, Andrew.
Hi, this is Andrew Mills from Cal CCA. I just wanted to understand the response to our comments about trying to, account for cost implications with the distribution that's chosen. So it sounded like you were saying that the choice of the distribution would be informed by the summer assessment in each year. And just wanted to understand that, going into a summer, you might have sufficient resources that, doesn't look like you're even going to hit a 0.1 LLE because it's a surplus of resources or something like that. So in that case, you'd go into it and say, okay, we have sufficient resources and we wouldn't even have any event. So you don't even get a distribution because it's, maybe everything's adequate. And at that point, I think you have to then sort of make a decision. Well, we're going to calibrate this and start to remove resources so that we do get a 0.1 LOLE and we do see what the distribution looks like. And I think what we're getting at is that you're making a choice when you start to decide which months do we sort of pull resources out of, or how do we adjust this portfolio so that we start to get events to surface. And that what we're asking is that you sort of consciously think about how we allocate those events to different months, or how we make those choices so that it reflects the fact that resources might be most expensive in some of those particular months, particularly September, July, August months. So maybe just to kind of ask that clarifying question, if you did have a summer assessment that says, we don't have a lot of events, do you then calibrate to get to a 0.1 LOLE? And what would be your decisions that you would use to adjust the portfolio to get to that 0.1 LOLE?
Thanks, Andrew. So right now, our summer assessment for 2025 actually did show a surplus that we had a significantly more reliable system than a 0.1. Maybe it's not the right word, but we didn't have the number of events that would result in a 0.1 LOLE. And the way that we surfaced the 0.1 or the events to get to that 0.1 LOLE was by doing an annual calibration. So we found an annual surplus. And so that's how we currently handle the summer assessment to calculate what surplus we get. And we use that surplus in our model to start us at the point where we have that 0.1 LOLE with the changes that we made and the recalibration, but we kept that same profile overall. We do have another slide that talks about what distribution we actually used for it, and there was some movement from the summer assessment, but less than we originally talked about 2 weeks ago. And that was mostly moving some events from September into June, where we do see some elevated risk in June overall, and historically we've had some peaks there. But right now, that's the changes that we made. Yeah, thank you.
And Andrew, this is Aditya. The comment on what Mark was mentioning is in the summer assessment, when you run the model with all our eligible resources and the import assumption, you would get, we got a surplus of 1451 megawatts. The way we achieved that is by reducing the amount of import available to the system. And by doing that, that's when we were able to surface the 50 events that we talk about. So that's how we get to 50 first, answering the question, which is, yes, we have to get to a 0.1 LOLE. And then the observed event distribution is what is our starting point. Hope that answered your question.
Thank you. Next, we have one more question from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Medicine. I just have a question about timing that occurred to me with that last question. You're going to use the summer assessment, but that's essentially you'll be using the summer assessment from the prior year, correct? So like you just said the results came out for the 25 summer assessment. That's what you'd be using to determine these values for the 26 RA year.
Correct. Currently, we're looking at using the 2025 summer assessment, using that model and the same input. So we'd essentially be creating a QC and PRM based off of 2025 for use in the future year.
Okay, and can you just remind me when the results of that are typically put out?
The summer assessment is normally published beginning of May,
Okay.
plus or minus about a week.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Great.
So just to do a quick review of what we talked about a couple weeks ago for the process we go through for the modeling. So we do start with our summer assessment model. We build that model out to make sure it's all RA eligible resources. We do that monthly risk tolerance calibration. This goes through a couple stages. The first is we do take that calibration from the summer assessment model. We did have to make some changes to that model to make sure that we do only the RA eligible resources. So we did some recalibration, but we went to the same exact target event by month. And we did that through gas once we made the final change. And then we go through the resource accreditation methodologies, which is, for ELCC resources, that's removing all of one particular type of resource, finding out how much perfect capacity is needed to be back in. And so that perfect capacity is what it gets offset, and we do some modification to that to make sure we're not overcounting interactive effects. And we also add up the UCAP values and the other methodologies that we use. And from there, we use that information to build out our monthly PRMs. So some of the calibrations that we used or changes that we used to the summer assessment model, we removed the utility demand response. So these resources don't receive they're not on the NQC list. They don't currently have NQC values. And so we're not planning to give them QC values. The model's then recalibrated to that 0.1 by modifying the import limits on an annual basis. And we use the same distribution of event that before. Excuse me. We did also, and forgive me, we didn't note this here, we did increase the amount of battery installed capacity in the beginning part of the year to be equal across the whole year. I believe the total installed capacity from the summer assessment model that we have in December was the same starting in about June. And so we just increased it across all months of the year. So that number should be a little bit more stable or reflective of what we'd expect to be there with a stable resource mix or more stable resource mix. Then that didn't require any recalibration because we weren't impacting the months that surfaced LOLE, and adding the additional capacity should have only increased reliability. We then removed also all planned outages, and this is because the RA program requires substitution for planned outages, so we don't want to account for planned outages in our modeling, and then also require substitution over counting the need at that point. And then we calibrated the model using gas capacity. This was shown at our meeting 2 weeks ago. So we did remove gas capacity from the model to surface LOLE in all months. And then we began to add gas capacity back in, going from largest to smallest. That was split between PG&E and SCE, SDG&E regions. And then we got past the point that we needed to calibrate. We took a step back, started from the bottom, and added plants in, smaller plants first. Oh, sorry, I'm moving forward twice, and I forgot that. And then in a couple months, or 1 month in particular, September, with the new event distribution that we have, we ended up needing all the gas capacity and then some additional imports to be added to the system. And so our proposal here is, or what we did was we added all the gas capacity in, and then we added a couple 100 megawatts of additional supply through imports just for that month. So our our event distribution, originally it was 11 in July and August and 28 in September. Those are the results that we presented last or 2 weeks ago. We moved 6 of those events from September into June to account for the heightened risks that we do see in June, have seen over time, and to move the September events a little lower, which should have a minor impact on the September ELCC based off the distributions. I can pause here. We do have a
In the queue, we have a question from Paul Nelson. Go ahead, Paul.
This is Paul Nelson from the CPUC Energy Division. On the demand response, then are you using a load modifier then for DR programs? If you're not putting them in as a supply side resource?
for the utility demand response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
No, we're not modeling that at all. It's not included in the model. It's an accredited resource, so it's not something we wanted to include in the model when we're trying to establish UC value for only resources that are part of the RA program. That doesn't mean
so if you have 1,000 megawatts of DR available, it's essentially not accounted for at all then.
Correct, because it wouldn't receive a QC value.
Okay.
Next in the queue, we have Noah Ting. Go ahead, Noah.
From Middle River Park, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Great. Couple of things, and maybe this is more geared towards like inputs and assumptions stage later on. Do you know what the sensitivity? Aditya talked about removal of import capacity in like September to surface LOE events. What is the what is the sensitivity of removing input capacity versus thermal resources?
I don't have a solid answer for you. I think with the amount of capacity we talked about in September, it should have a relatively negligible impact. It should be fairly minor. I wouldn't be surprised if it exists, but it should be fairly small. When you
Yeah.
start talking about removing tens of thousands of megawatts of gas versus adding or subtracting tens of thousands of watts of load, that's going to be a major impact on the effective load shape. But I have not studied that. I apologize.
Yeah, it just sort of occurring to me that you know, generally when we look at LLE studies, the input capacity sort of stays flat-ish, right, during summer months and not we have more of it during shoulder months. And so the comment by Aditya about removing imports and what I then interpret to mean not removing thermal in September was just a little bit curious. Second point, I know, you know, we've talked about removal of planned outages or not including planned outages because they're all substituted. To the extent there are, you know, as I recall, planned outages that are not substituted, such as transmission-induced planned outages, you might want to consider and put that in just so that you have a sort of accuracy on what is actually not available versus what is to be substituted from the market.
Thank you for that. We will take that into consideration.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Steve Keen. Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, it's Steve Keen from Edison again. I just want to make sure I'm understanding the way you're doing this process correctly. So when you talk about removing the imports, that's on an annual basis. So you run the LOLE for an annual basis, then you pull back the imports until the LOLE hits 0.1 on an annual basis. And then to calibrate each month, that's where you're talking about removing the gas plants. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And I know you said something about this, but I didn't register at the time. But when you remove those gas plants, how are you removing them? I mean, are you? And I guess the question has to do with whether removing specific plants might cause issues in certain areas. I think this is maybe getting back to the question with local before, but I'm thinking not so much with local, but just with some of the congestion. You know, if all the plants you took out were in San Diego, it's likely that you would, you know, create a number of problems in San Diego, as opposed to maybe, you know, removing one plant in San Diego, one in Edison, and one in PG&E.
So we have a zonal model. We have 4 zones. PG&E is broken into Bay and Valley, and PG&E has a region. And then we have an external region, but we didn't pull out gas plants there. So what we did was we stacked all the gas plants in the PG&E regions from smallest to largest, and then we did the same for both PG&E and stacked them from smallest to largest, and then we placed them in order, trying to keep approximately the same amount of capacity removed from both regions. You go up that or up or down the list. So they're, you know, the type of plants are a little bit different in each region. Go figure, right? And so in some cases, you removed 2 or 3 plants in PG&E, and then we removed the plant from the southern region. At other times, we had to remove a couple in a row from the southern region, and then so there was a little bit of that, but we tried to keep the distribution relatively in the north and southern part of the state for our model.
Okay. And then one last question with the following up on the DR that's not included in the model. I'm just trying to think through whether that could potentially lead to the PRM being too high if you're not accounting for the DR either on the load side or the supply side?
Steve, this is Aditya. So in the summer assessment model, we model both the classes of demand response, PDR and RDRR. But in the QC process, we're only giving it to the PDRs because they get a QC value and RDRR does not. So we made some adjustments to make sure that we don't remove anything more than 1451 megawatts to get to that 0.1 calibrated starting portfolio.
Okay.
So it is in the model. It was in the model, yeah.
All right. So that's a good clarification. So what you said is PDR is actually in the model. It's just the RDRR that's not.
Yeah, RDRR was in the summer assessment model because they can be accessed before an emergency. So they are modeled. So with the inclusion of that, you get to a surplus of 1451 megawatts. But by the time we get to building these monthly models, we now have to remove 1451. And the way we did that is reduce the import by 400 and something, and then 1,000 megawatts of RDRR. So we capture the impact, but wanted to make sure all the resources that get QC are represented accurately.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Also have a written comment in the chat from Eric Leon Renew asking, just RDRR does not get a QC value or all IOU DR, including RDRR and IOU PDRs?
This is Abdul. The only PDRs, we're getting QC values for them today from the CPUC. So they are on the NQC list. That's the only type that is showing up on the NQC list. That's we're not RDRRs are eligible to be on the NQC list and get QC. We just haven't received QCs for them.
And I'm not seeing, we did actually just receive a question from Luke Tugas. Go ahead, Luke.
California Efficiency and Demand Management Council. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Great, thank you. I don't really have a big dog in this fight, but I do want to mention, just to help clarify the discussion here, is that the utilities do get a QC value, but it's reflected as a credit against their and other LSCs resource adequacy requirements. And those resources, those programs, excuse me, are bid in as proxy demand resources. So, you know, maybe there's a little bit of imprecision in the language being used there during the discussion here, but I just want to make sure that folks understand, you know, going back to, I think what Paul Nelson was saying, using the 1,000 megawatt example, if, you know, that 1,000 megawatts, using his example, does have an impact on the resource adequacy requirements of utilities and other LSCs. And so I would suggest that they do need to be accounted for in some way.
Thanks, Luke.
All right, great questions. So we received numerous comments on the default QC methodology for dispatchable thermal and pumped storage hydro, which is the UCAP methodology. So I'm going to review several of those comments here. We have 5 pages of comments, so hang with me, and then we'll touch on the changes that we're considering to the proposal. So we had several comments on the assessment hours or how to determine system need in the UCAP calculation, which was proposed as the supply cushion equation. Frankly, I'm not going to review each of these because there were numerous, as I mentioned, but there was a lot of feedback that was critical of the supply cushion calculation, and you can review those comments on the stakeholder initiative website or on these slides. But Generally, I will respond and indicate that CAISO has a revised proposal for determining system need based on this stakeholder feedback. There were comments about how the planned outages impact the UCAP calculation. We discussed that at the August workshop. We also heard about how, concerns about the heat map that was shown in the August workshop, as well as about the disconnect between the modeled or the studied risk hours in the model versus what was developed under the supply cushion equation. So taking all that into consideration, we have a revised proposal for how to determine system need. We also heard many comments on which natures of work for forced outages should be included in resource-specific forced outage rates in the UCAP calculation. I will review these. So CESA California Energy Storage Association commented that they consistently oppose the selection of specific outage nature of work codes for UCAP purposes because that CAISO has not yet provided an unambiguous UCAP forced outage definition, guiding principles and rationales for the selections. CESA also indicated the forced outage rate used to determine the UCAP value should not reflect outages used to ensure an accurate dispatch of a resource operating within its design specifications. Rev Renewables indicated a recommendation to, at minimum, exclude market model related outages, including technical limitations not in the market model in the forced outage rate. There was a similar comment from San Diego Gas and Electric. And then Rev Renewables suggested aligning the forced outages with the NERC GADS Appendix K guidelines for outage codes whose causes are outside of management control. And then there was also a comment on the forced outages for energy storage from Cal Advocates, and we will address that later on. So the response is we have made a revision to the list of forced outage natures of work that was included in the August proposal, and that was also shared earlier this year, which was mostly based on the summer assessment forced outage list that was included in that study. So big picture, to better predict future availability of resource contribution to overall reliability, which is based on the objective that I shared at the beginning of this morning's presentation, all forced outage natures of work will be considered in the rate. And we will discuss which exactly are going to be included in a few slides. And finally, there were a few comments on what I'm characterizing as historic performance anomalies. So 6 cities indicated that a resource may undergo significant maintenance work. Oh, we had a little loss of load event in the room, but we're back. Okay, if a generation resource undergoes significant maintenance work, that makes the proposed 3-year look back of outage data, so the historic consideration of forced outage rates for each resource, and it may make that not an accurate representation of a resource's forward-looking capabilities. The SC should be able to provide CAISO with updated information about the resource's anticipated performance that would be an adjustment to the UCAP value for that resource. 6 cities also floated an alternative approach that would remove the worst performing year within the historic period, but this would assume that the effects of any major maintenance would be shown through a year with poor performance, which may not be the case. We also heard from NCPA, Northern California Power Agency, that reiterates its request that the CAISO modify and expand upon the proposal for an adjustment factor to include an option where a resource owner can submit a request to CAISO to reset the default QC value to reflect a resource's operational capability through an attestation or operational test. So in response to these comments, CAISO, the weighted approach that has been proposed previously remains, and that allows a credit, or essentially to credit improved performance, forced outage rates quickly, based on recent performance by that resource, which may be caused by maintenance or other improvements. However, notwithstanding, stepping back, local regulatory authorities continue to retain the ability to set individual resource QC values, and the NQC update process from LRAs remains the same. So in any case, these are the default rules, and LRAs, such as we've heard from here, will continue to retain the authority to modify QC values based on these conditions. Great. So we have, this is slide 31. We have two slides on the new UCAP methodology that we're considering based on these comments that we just reviewed. So let's get through these slides, and then we can check in about a break, and we can have more discussion on these after the break.
Thank you, Ansel. So the unforced capacity methodology that we're looking at continues to break out months into summer and winter periods. So May through October for summer, and winter is November through April. Again, this is only for dispatchable thermal, pumped hydro, nuclear. Of the forced outages are sourced from the OMS system, and we're looking at at-risk hours during the top 10 net load days from each month over the past 3 years. So all the forced outages except transmission induced and force majeure outages would be accounted for in the UCAP calculation. This is an attempt to look at outages outside of management control, and those align with OMS codes that we've got right now. The accounting rules will be included in the tariff, or should reflect the contribution of different resource types and individual resources to maintaining a balancing authority area-wide and local reliability. So we want to make sure that we're capturing outages that give us insight into how reliability would look like across the system. The at-risk hours, we are defining those based off of where we're seeing risk in our summer assessment, or at least heavily informing it by that. So for summer, that's hours 17 through 22. And then for winter, we're continuing to use 17 through 22, but also including 6 to 9 based off of some of the net loads in the morning being equivalent to or very similar to the net loads in the evening during the winter months. The past 3 years of operational data are going to be used again, providing a heavier weight towards the most recent years. And the numbers you'll see at the end, they actually use May 2022 through April 2025. That keeps the winter seasons, it keeps contiguous months for the winter seasons, and not splitting up. So not using the first 4 months of 2022 and the last 2 months. Instead, it's using 6 months that are one right after the other. These equations are the same as what we had before previously. The only things that have changed is which specific hours are being taken into account. So instead of using the supply cushion hours, we'd be using those at-risk hours as defined on the previous slide from each month, and with the weighting that we have here. I think I can go to questions.
Raise from Perry Servedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Really quick, sorry, Christina, is
Go
Abdul.
ahead.
Just to reiterate what Mark said, because of the feedback we got from stakeholders about our supply cushion methodology, we modified it to look at-risk hours, as you guys can see in the previous slide. So that's the main and major change that you're seeing, and it's driven by stakeholder comments on the draft final proposal.
Okay, we can go to Perry now. And Perry, just a reminder, we're about to take a break soon, but we can take more discussion.
Hey, this is Perry Servedio, CISA. Thanks. Yeah, I hear you on the break. I just wanted to say that we are very supportive of CISA moving in this direction for the hours assessment to be aligned with the critical hours based on study. That was a comment that we had made earlier on. We still would like to see it go towards a full E4D, because that could really, that would probably really get you more of the potential random hours here and there in which resources would be in demand but may fall outside of these assigned hours. But this approach does give you the effect of better aligning the hours between those resources that are under the UCAP methodology and those resources that are under the ELCC methodology, to make those comparisons between those resource types more comparable, I guess is the way to say that. However, we would still like to hear about the selection of the natures of work. If you have a slide on that coming up, I can hold unless it was just the previous slide response.
No, Perry, we don't have a separate slide on that one.
Okay, so can you clarify the principle and rationale for the selection of, it looked like, all natures of work to be counted against the UCAP value?
Yeah, so our goal is to include anything that's, sorry, I'm going to have a double negative if I say it that way. We want to include everything except for those things that are outside of management control. And so we have heard, the transmission-induced outages are largely outside of management control, as well as force majeure events. We did take a look at what's in Appendix K of the NERC's GADS, and that generally makes sense. But all of the other outages, or the other outage codes actually, are generally speaking representing something that's within management control, either by increasing maintenance, or it's just the nature of the resource as it is and needs to be accounted for in how they are credited in some way.
Okay, could you go back? I think it's one slide where you have the response to the natures of work. Maybe one more slide. Yeah, better predict future availability or resource contribution to overall reliability. I'm taking that as maybe now being the principle and rationale that's written somewhere, because this is what we had commented on, that this was lacking in the actual proposal. So is this now the written principle and rationale, that better predict future availability or resource contribution?
Yes, and it is based on the objectives from the issue paper coming out of the working group that we shared at the beginning of the meeting. And we also, Kaiso, included the outside management control guiding comment from the June straw proposal, which was not included in the August proposal, which you highlighted and stakeholders highlighted. So we will provide a more direct tie between these principles within the revised proposal issued next week. And I'll hand it to Partha too.
Okay. You covered it well, Ansel. Yeah, I think that the real tie-in is be willing to go, I think it's forward one slide. I apologize. Yeah, but basically that one. Yeah, I think that one of the main principles is obviously that, as we've alluded to, I think throughout the working group process, as well as through sort of the iterations, is like we're wanting to make sure that whatever county rules we develop, that they work well with the LRA programs, but they also reasonably reflect the relative contribution of different resource types, as well as individual resources, to maintaining the BA-wide reliability. And so the selection of like which work criteria, there's probably a number of different objectives, but that's probably at least like one of the key ones, is that whether or not they include or not, if it's materially affecting what its relative contribution is to reliability, I think it should be included within the calculation for UCAP. So I think that's probably the main principle we're focusing in on, Perry.
Okay, could I ask then, just back to the comments slide, CISA was not the only entity that commented on resources that are perhaps operating within their design specifications, yet need to provide an outage to CAISO because they may be lacking the particular limitation in their market model. I think also San Diego Gas and Electric and potentially Pacific Gas and Electric also made the same comment. And I would then think that, you know, based on your rationale here, can you explain why technical limitations not in market model would be also, I guess, eligible to count against a resource's UCAP value?
I can chime in here. This is Abdul. Technical limitation not in the market model is in attempting to reflect a operational limitation that the resource has that is not modeled in the market model, and therefore the outage card is the way there to reflect that limitation, as I understand it, because we are trying to predict future availability of resources. This limitation, unless we change the market model and we were able to model this limitation, we would expect it to continue to derate the resource going forward, making it unavailable. And therefore, it is an appropriate nature of work, we think, to be included in the UCAP assessment, because again, we're trying to predict their future availability and contribution to reliability. So this outage that the resource needed to use in the past, it is fair to assume that they'll continue to need to use it until that market model is updated. This is not a penalty. This is not a RAIM. It's more of a how much of the resource can be available to contribute to reliability. And that's what counting rules are trying to achieve. And that's what UCAP, this default UCAP methodology is attempting to do.
Well, just first on that last point, I would argue this is a penalty, and it's actually a much more severe penalty than the RAIM, because this impacts the sale value, which is currently at market rates higher than the RAIM rates. So this is a penalty if you're derating resources due to this UCAP value, and that's why I think you're seeing so much stakeholder engagement on this particular issue. Now, hearing the rationale of predicting future availability of resource contribution, I would like to ask then if an MSG resource that is operating in a 1-by-1 configuration during the assessment hours would see a derate to their UCAP value.
If they need to report their derate in an outage card, then yes, it will be reflected. If their limitation is modeled in the market and an outage card is not needed, then they would not be impacted. Again,
no, the resource is not. Once CAISO drives it into the 1-by-1 configuration, the resource cannot provide 2-by-1 Pmax. So, by your logic of future availability or resource contribution during these hours, I would say outage or no outage, you're not getting the availability from that resource in that hour that you need.
Does the CAISO, you're saying the CAISO drove the resource to a 1-by-1 configuration?
Yeah, it's a model. It's in the market model. It's a limitation that's in the market model, yet it is not available to its 2-by-1 Pmax.
Right. So the CAISO market is dispatching the resource to the correct configuration as needed because it can do that. In this case, we cannot do that. The resource is reflecting that limitation with an outage card because the limitation is not modeled. So whether
so you're going to have some resources. You're going to have some resources that get the derate, and others that are doing the exact same thing, but that limitation's not in the market or is in the market model not get the D rate?
I can say it's the exact same thing, but what we are trying to say here is the way to reflect that limitation historically was using an outage card. Therefore, it is fair to assume that in the future, unless the market model changes, the outage card will be used. Therefore, the resource will not be available for us for dispatch. So that's the concept, and prediction of future resource contribution is the keyword here.
No, I hear you. And like I said, I'm hearing that the rationale is availability of the resource contribution overall reliability. And it would seem to me that based on that rationale, a resource operating in a 1-by-1 configuration is not fully available to the 2-by-1 PMAX to CAISO, and therefore should see some kind of D-rate related to the capacity that's not available.
I think we are talking past each other. So let me wrap up my response with this reminder. The reminder is, I think we said it a few times across today's call and in the past, is these are our default counting qualifying capacity methodologies. These, today in the tariff, we have UC rules existing in the tariff. They've been there, as far as I know, from the day one of RA, roughly 20 years ago. They've never been used, as far as I know, by the CAISO or the LRAs, because these are default rules. We have never updated them. We are attempting to update these rules today in this discussion. We will continue to work with stakeholders to enhance them in the future as needed. But I think the key thing for you, Perry, and for all the participants, because it was a common questions, common theme, maybe misunderstanding. These are the default rules. They will not impact the NQC. They will not impact the RA showings. They will not impact resources financially in any way unless something changes and the PUC and other LRAs stop providing QC values to the CAISO. If it's never happened in the past, the PUC is not planning, at least the CPUC is not planning to stop calculating, providing QC values for the fleet to the CAISO. So just a reminder there, these are default counting rules.
Yeah, I hear you on that. And we've heard others at CAISO also point that out. I'm just not sure that that's a great excuse for logical inconsistencies in an accreditation value. So I'd like to really just get back to having a logically consistent and principled accreditation value, as that's what we're here to do in the policy development process. And the main concern that we have is that if certain resources have technical limitations that are not in the market model, then they will receive a lower UCAP value than resources that have perhaps some of those same types of limitations, but are in the resource model. And there's in our mind, it would be inconsistent to treat those two resources differently from an accreditation standpoint. Because if you were to get the first set of resource limitations into the market model, you would no longer be derating their accreditation value. And that does not seem like that is something within the resource's control. It seems like it is something within CAISO's control in two ways. First, modeling of the limitation within the resource model. Second, CAISO is in control of driving the resource based on bids that it received up to 2 hours ago. And if CAISO drives the resource into, say, a transitional limitation or some other not modeled limitation, just happens to drive it there that day and that hour, then a resource is going to get their accreditation value hit. And CAISO will be driving other resources into and meeting the same limitations, not requiring outages, and giving those resources higher accreditation values. It's very important, and I thought that we've made this point clear in our comments, that we have the accreditation values be comparable across resources and resource types and be logically consistent.
Thank you for the comments, Barry. You took us past the break. The CAISO team definitely need the break for various reasons. I'll say that regardless of why the D rate is there, the resource is not available. Who drives it doesn't change the fact that it's not available for reliability. I think that's what we're trying to say. That's why it's a counting rule. It's not a RAIM assessment. But
and the MSG resource in a 1x1 is not available for reliability at its 2x1 PMAX.
I will not start the comparison with other resources right now, but we would love to hear back from you after the break. So Christina, can you take us to break, please?
See if you could please pull up the break slide. We're going to take a 5-minute break now and return shortly. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to be getting started again. Back to unforced capacity methodology.
All right. Looks like we have another hand
Raised by Noah Tang. Go ahead, Noah.
Hey, this is Noah Tom from Middle River Power. As I was just listening to Abdul and Barry talk, it seems like as if the ISO is saying these are default counting rules that we're updating, and no one has ever used them. But I recall a presentation that the ISO has done at maybe a while back that said several LRAs outside of the PUC point to the ISO's default counting rules as part of their accreditation. And so to the extent that the ISO changes its own default counting rules, those LRAs are going to be using these new accreditation methodologies as well.
Yeah, I know. This is Abdul. The LRAs that point, what we said about some LRAs pointing to our default, it's the default PRM, not the qualifying capacity rules for the resources. We're not aware of any LRA using our default counting rules as of today or in the past.
But to the extent some LRAs have the same methodology that the ISO's current default counting rules have, you can see some of that in, I think, NTPA's request with or comments right to the ISO, which is saying, they need to have their ability to update the counting rules so that it doesn't, so that the default doesn't hit them and so forth. To the extent that LRAs do use the default counting rules, even though it doesn't say, oh, we're exactly matching, or rather we're exactly pointing to, but here's the methodology and they're the same. To me, that seems like as if those LRAs are using the ISO's default counting rules because the ISO has set up a program to allow them to do that so that they can meet reliability. So I want to make sure, like, I want to make sure that we are talking about sort of the same thing, why this is important in the sense that, even though the ISO is updating the default counting rules to which it keeps saying that it's not being used by anyone, it is important to have a holistic program to which other people are using.
Thanks, Noah. We're going to go to Partha next. Go ahead, Partha.
No, thanks, Noah. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that I certainly think that we're wanting to make sure that we're getting it right, and that, we recognize the fact that, like, in the future, we really want to have a design that LRAs can look to and say, like, these are reasonable, at least a reasonable starting place to formulate PRMs and to formulate their own accreditation rules to the degree that they are looking to achieve those. So I think we are certainly looking to get it right. Maybe just sort of tie back to some of Perry's conversation. I also think that we kind of recognize at the ISO, these topics around storage, availability, and performance. And I think it's really kind of the question around what does it mean to be available and to perform well, sort of in accordance to the RA rules. But I think we recognize this is really an evolving topic, and that there's been lots of questions raised about kind of the use of outage cards, certain instances where it might be the ISO's dispatch, or it might be sort of how the resources performs itself that might lead it to be unavailable during certain periods, and questions on, should this or should this not be a ding against accreditation? Should this or should this not have some sort of RAIM or RAIM replacement mechanism? And we kind of recognize this is really an evolving and challenging issue. So in the case of this default, I think that, like, Perry's points and your points are well taken. I think we've gotten to a reasonable point in terms of this being a better methodology than we have today. But I also think that, like, it's probably really is an evolving topic that we're going to keep on looking at in terms of making sure that we are being kind of consistent and have them be right and effective. So yeah, no, I appreciate Perry's input and your comments too here. But any response, Noah?
Thanks, Bart. Yeah, thanks, Bart. The thing we've been advocating for is the short notice opportunity outages that are considered forced outages because they have to be submitted within the 7-day window. Our main issue is in the past, since the ISO has created this opportunity for such natures of work, the grid operator, the ISO, sort of saw it to say that, hey, these outages can be taken because they're not a reliability challenge, and it's because there's sufficient capacity on the grid. And so to now account for those within the UCAP, we don't think that is reasonable, because it is essentially saying, yeah, we will let you do in the past, but now we're going to count it against you, which is what was not intended to do when such the short notice opportunities were created. So I think we should have that principle going forward under UCAP as well.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, we've made a note of your comment on the short notice opportunity, so appreciate the comments.
Sorry, what was the note that you created or you noted?
Your comment was indicating that short notice opportunity outages should not be included in the calculation. Did I hear that correctly?
Correct.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
I have one more slide of comments review on RAIM. I think we covered this on the overview slide for the most part, but I would like to run through these comments. So Middle River Power shared that a critically important topic not discussed in the track one draft final proposal is the interplay between the must offer obligation attaches to resource to selling RA capacity and the RA UCAP capacity value. And Cal Advocates raised that in the next iteration of the proposal, the CAISO should clarify if RAIM would apply to resources that use the UCAP accreditation. And finally, Pacific Gas and Electric shared that they suggest moving elements of the UCAP methodology portion of track 1 to track 2. So acknowledging that stakeholders correctly recognize that that RAIM modifications are not in scope of track 1, are not currently in scope and will not be. just responding that RAIM will be reevaluated, as Partha mentioned earlier, in track 2, in consideration with LRA QC methodologies and the comments that were shared here, including the interplay between RAIM, the must-offer obligations, and the QC methodologies. So we heard some comments on that this morning, acknowledging that is critical to consider and was a part of the working group conversation and will be discussed in track 2. But track 1 is focused narrowly on the window of the default rules. So the next section we have is reviewing the average ELCC methodology and unit-specific adjustments, but are there any additional comments on this section? We heard a lot of great discussion today.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
All right. So we had a handful of comments on the ELCC methodology as a default counting rule for several resource classes. So first, we had a few comments on the ELCC methodology for energy storage resources. We touched on the long duration or the varying duration distinctions that stakeholders raised earlier today. Rev Renewables commented that, as discussed at the stakeholder meeting, CAISO should provide greater clarity on battery duration treatment in its default QC counting rules. I'm sorry, that was from Association of Retail Energy Markets. Rev Renewables recommended one QC methodology with sub-resource types for different durations of storage. And in response, as we mentioned earlier, CAISO will work with stakeholders in the future in annual processes to determine default QC methodologies for new resource types, and that may include long-duration energy storage. There was also a comment from Rev Renewables about the distinction between using a UCAP methodology for pump storage hydro resources and ELCC for battery storage, and we addressed that earlier as well. Moving to the topic of ELCC for dispatchable and run-of-river hydro. So NCPA shared that they do not support bundling dispatchable hydro facilities and run-of-river hydro facilities into a single resource type under the ELCC study. So in response to some comments about this distinction from NCPA and others, CAISO has a revised proposal to allocate the class-wide hydro ELCC between these two different subcategories. And we'll speak more to that in the next slides. And then this comment was addressed earlier as well in the QC process, but Department of Water Resources indicated that CAISO should allow updates to monthly demand forecasts for hydro pumping loads that are primarily hydrology dependent. So this is related to pumping loads, but just acknowledging that there is no change to the current policy that allows LRAs to update QC values monthly. But we also, as indicated earlier, have changed have allowed changes to the hydro study inputs based on hydrology. And with that, I will hand it to Mark to review the ELCC methodology.
Thank you. So, forgive me. Some of these slides you will remember from last time around. Go high level through it. The way we modeled the average ELCCs was we had the calibrated resource mix. We removed the capacity that we were studying specifically. So for wind, we removed all the wind capacity. Then we added back in perfect capacity until we got to the correct number of events. And by correct, I mean the same number of events. And then from there, we ran each of the categories individually, and then we ran them all. One, we reduced the capacity, the perfect capacity for each, so that some residual are added to all resources. Better equation for that. So again, we started off with a reliable system. We removed capacity. We added perfect capacity back in. We repeated that. This alpha equation is what I was talking about before, where the perfect capacity for each resource individually was added to all the individual capacities for the other resources and divided by the total, or perfect capacity for all the resources removed at once. That alpha factor was positive, I believe, in every month for results. And so that brought down the total ELC.
Before we move on, I would like to mention Doug Harpa from Peninsula Clean Energy, who had a comment in the chat earlier about this. Doug, just giving you an opportunity to further clarify if this didn't answer your question about the ELCC methodology.
Hand raised from Doug. Go ahead, Doug.
Curiosity. It comes to, I mean, I think I understand it. I think I'm just clarifying that I do in fact understand this. So the methodology, yeah, I guess this is the one. Start with the base system with 10 events a month. In order to get to that, that is the set of resources as they exist on the system, or actually now it sounds like you had to remove resources in order to surface that level of loss of load expectation.
Correct. So for the summer
Okay.
months where there was loss of load events already, the calibration was a lot smaller and mostly just covered the removal of any kind of planned outages. For other months, say in the winter, the calibration was a lot higher because there were no events and there was enough capacity there to be well above the normal. So we actually calibrated this down to one event higher than the target. And then we added capacity in until that event disappeared. So we got.
Gotcha. Okay. So it's very similar to the ELC or to the E3 methodology.
Yes, I mean, there are definitely some differences, but it's the same general concept. Yeah. We just moved different resources.
Yeah, the first time I read it, I thought you were not removing resources. You were just going like with the loss of load expectation as they exist in the world today, which I thought was like, that's really close to zero. Bully on you for trying that. So I was a little surprised. So, okay, great. Thank you so much.
And Doug, to be clear, we do have zero loss of load expectation is the target in some of those months. But we did move down the amount of capacity so that it was the lowest amount of capacity needed to hit that target to start with.
Gotcha. And yeah, the thing that motivates the question too is just that the ELCC values change depending, of course, on the resource mix. So when you start pulling things out, you're inherently changing the ELCCs that you're trying to estimate. But anyway, as I say, idle curiosity. I appreciate the clarification.
And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
So for hydro, we heard comments, wanting to break out the run-of-river hydro versus dispatchable hydro. We did attempt to estimate what that breakout would look like and tried to credit them differently in the cycle. So what we did was we kept the modeling the same. We then allocated the qualifying capacity that was calculated for all of the hydro resources to run-of-river and dispatchable based off of the nameplate or the installed capacity that we had. The ELCCs for run-of-river hydro was then calculated based off that installed capacity without any modification. For dispatchable hydro, we did end up we modified that installed capacity for the calculation, and we adjusted it downwards to the monthly maximum rating that we provided in the model, and then increased that based off of the forced outages. So if there was 100 megawatts of dispatchable hydro allowed in that month, that was the max rating. And say the forced outages were 10%, we used a 110 megawatt number as the installed capacity in the ELCC calculation. This is just to account for the fact that any limitations you place on the dispatchable hydro does impact how much ELCC it can provide. And we were modeling off of an average hydro year. So we did try and calibrate for that. I'm going into the individual resource accreditation allocation for ELCC resources. This was in the paper published last month. For batteries and now dispatchable hydro, we're allocating ELCCs based off of outage rates or the resources availability. So if the resource has a better forced outage rate, it would get a higher fee. At a lower forced or a worse forced outage rate, then the resource as a whole. For wind and solar and run-of-river hydro now, we did a similar equation, but it was based off the capacity factor during hours. So it was the amount of output of that resource divided by capacity of that resource during those hours compared to capacity factor of the fleet as a whole. Meaning if your resource provided more capacity in those hours than fleet did on average compared to the total installed capacity, your ELCC would go up. If it provided less. We do have some distributions for that for the 5 groupings of resources. So this is how the ELCCs break down for LESRs. Many of the resources don't have 3 years of operation data, and so they were assigned class average ELCC or ours. And so you can see how the ELCC, that average ELCC, also stated where that's grouped in and how. Have some higher summer months. For dispatchable hydro, it's also done based on forced outage. You do see a bit of a spread there as well. Time of the year and how those resources have. The shaded bars are pretty small here because most resources actually have enough data. But you can't see that if you look in closely. I can't see it from here, but that's my eyes. For run-of-river hydro, you do again see a bit of that split and a shift over the years, but this is how things break down. And I should mention the y-axis is the installed capacity that's accredited this way. It's not the total QC in those grouping. For solar, this is wind. I apologize. For wind, did you see the distribution as well? Happy to answer any questions that folks have on these. And solar. Sorry, this is run-of-river. I apologize. I confused. I mixed these up. I apologize. Our solar resources are here. And this is our wind resource. I apologize. I didn't adjust the heading.
Not seeing any questions coming in at this time.
So the graph title is correct, but the slide title is incorrect.
Correct. That I can pass it back to Ansel. Oh, we didn't have any comments on non-dispatchable. So non-dispatchable thermal resources, this would include gas, geothermal, biomass. It does not include nuclear, which is non-dispatchable, but is have accreditation. So this hasn't changed since the previous meeting. It's just an average of the total generation so for January, it'd be the total generation in January for the past 3 years divided by the hours in those months. Can answer any questions you have on that. Otherwise, we can move on. DR.
Seeing any questions at this time?
And I can pass this to Ansel to address comments on the DR resource.
We have a hand from Perry Servedio. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Servedio, CISA. Sorry, I caught it a little bit late, but this is really a comment towards the ELCC section. And I was just wondering if you can cover one more time which outages are included in these forced outage rates in this equation, particularly of interest to us is for the batteries.
At this point, all forced outage rates except for transmission related outages were included.
Okay, and it's a relative comparison across just the force outage rate aggregate within the resource type or across all resources?
Just the resource type. So we calculated the FOR resource is for the individual resource, and the forced outage rate for the aggregate is the outage rate for all, in this case, batteries, calculated as one.
Okay.
So we are not mixing technologies here.
Okay. Well, I still, I think, have the same comments as before on refining those natures of work according to the rationale. You're saying, though, there is alignment in the selection of natures of work for, say, batteries versus the thermals, which is what we were talking about before under UCAP. Is that right?
Yes, it's the same forced outages. It's everything except for the transmission induced forced outage.
Okay. Well, our same comments from before the break also apply here. We've been clear that if a resource is operating within its design specifications, then it should not be an outage that's included in this forced outage rate. And we actually think that that would allow you to better differentiate your really good performers for batteries and your really bad performers for batteries.
Understood. Thank you for the comment.
Any other questions at this time?
All right, with that, I will pass it back to Ansel to start us on the DR section.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks, Perry, for your comment. So we had a few comments on the proposed default QC methodology for demand response resources. There were comments from California Efficiency and Demand Management Council and Renew Home related to the demand response performance factor, and there was some consideration in the proposal about applying the factor and how it should be applied at a demand response provider level. And these comments indicated that performance factors should be based on the weighted performance of a demand response provider's resources rather than the simple average of those resources. And the council, SEDMEC, recommends weighting by dispatch quantity, also known as total expected energy, and also by the sublap day ahead market locational marginal price. And then Renew Home added that they recommend the ratio be constrained to 1 at the aggregate level rather than the event hour level. So CAISO is open to future discussions in the ongoing annual process on how to refine the DR performance factor in the default QC methodology. Comments also indicated that very few, if any, demand response resources are indicated on supply plans outside of the CPUC, which has its own QC methodology of load impact protocol, and just wanted to acknowledge that. We also had some comments from Southern California Edison indicating that since a demand response provider can separate the types of DR into different resource IDs, CAISO should consider applying the performance-based UCAP by resource and not at the demand response provider level. So to that comment, we've taken that into consideration. In the paper, we indicated that this application at the DRP level was done because of the nature of the registration of demand response resources in the CAISO system, and that this would maintain a more consistent performance factor at the DR provider level. SEDMEC indicated that the council would like to stress the importance of the CAISO not applying a performance factor that are already being derated by the LRA based on the same performance. We addressed that earlier this morning, indicating that the factor should be applied based on claimed capacity. And if the local regulatory authority, for example, the CPUC, is using its load impact protocol, that would apply, and this performance factor would not apply at all. And then also indicating that the DR provider performance should be calculated at an annual level, because any variability across seasons would be distributed through the DR provider's annual performance. And so CAISO has taken that into account and will be moving forward with an annual performance factor. So I'll hand it to, well, let's take because we have a hand from Eric from Renew Home. So we just shared some comments. So Christina.
Go ahead, Eric. If we could unmute Eric, please.
And Energy Regulatory Manager from Renew Home. Thank you for bringing this up. We are, sort of really happy to see the outlines of a methodology that reflects sort of the same intuition that we were sort of supportive of in the, the incentive-based QC methodology working group. And particularly, it really sort of echoes the performance assessment, or excuse me, performance alignment metric that was proposed under that effort. And just to provide like a little intuition on, why we think weighting by dispatch quantity and LMP matters is, I think LMP is going to be really correlated with the times of greatest grid scarcity. But then also we want to make sure that it reflects sort of like the totality of the resource. So when you're doing test results, you're going to have a higher dispatch quantity. When a greater proportion of the resource is dispatched economically, you're going to have a greater dispatch quantity. When it's hotter out, weather sensitive resources are more likely to have a higher dispatch quantity. So sort of between those two things, we think that does a really good job of sort of the kind of a high level view of the resource. And I guess I'll add to that the LMP does a good job of accounting for losses and congestion. And so, there's that sort of helps us aggregate all the way up to a provider level across all these different, specific resource IDs. And on that note, I did just want to say, regarding SCE's comment that the DR should be done or the performance metric should be done at the resource ID level. I think we actually disagree on that. We think it's sort of riskier and more volatile to apply this at the resource ID level, and we prefer it at the aggregator or provider level. So I just wanted to share that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
Thank you, Eric. All right. So I'll hand it back to Mark to review the monthly PRM calculation. And then we do have, to wrap up, we will share some of those draft values that we just, for the methodologies that we discussed as well.
Thank you, Ansel. So the PRM that we will calculate monthly, this equation has not changed, but I would like to just remind folks that how we calculate the PRM for each month in our numbers is based off of the total qualifying capacity used in the model to have the portfolio meet the unserved energy event target. And the peak value that we used was the 1 and 2 peak from our profiles. So those numbers are not going to be exactly the same as the CED. Profiles are based off of the Energy Commission's energy demand forecast, but they do have variability in there. And so we went with 1 and 2 from that, as opposed to the peak in each month from the demand forecast. Taking a look at the capacity values that we have, and I will note that these pieces of information are based off of the fleet as a whole, not specifically what was in the model until we get to the PRM slide. So the draft UCAP percentages, these would be the percentages that get applied to the installed capacity for individual resources to get to their UCAP values, are weighted averages for each individual resource type. So as you'd expect, some resources are higher than this, some are lower than that, but they should average out to be approximately value. Hopefully you've noticed, if you looked at the numbers, that January through February and then November and December all have the same percentages, as well as May through October. And this is just to reiterate that we do have it split into summer and winter seasons. These draft QC values for the non-dispatchable thermal resources except nuclear, these numbers have not changed since the last time they were presented. Keep in mind, they're here, and it's based off of what generation output has been reported from these facilities on an individual basis. The draft demand response performance factor, again, this is a single annual performance factor, so these percentages should be the same across all months. If they're not, please let me know. This is what we have. I believe, depending on the resource grouping, because we showed seasonal numbers last time as well, and these annual numbers are generally closer to one of those seasons, significantly closer to one of the seasons, which suggests that the DR provider has a portfolio heavily weighted towards one season or the other. The draft battery, hydro, solar, and wind average ELCC values, these do account for the breakout that we estimated between run hydro and dispatchable hydro. This is what was in the model when we ran it. Would be the class average ELCCs. Have to apply those distributions showed earlier to this to get a resource specific ELCC. One thing that we did have folks ask questions on, the battery ELCCs, and I believe also the wind in December, it did drop down. For the batteries, we think that that actually does make sense once we increase the install capacity in January. The ELCCs did come down for January for the battery resources, not quite to December, as you may expect, but they did come down quite a bit. The wind, I don't have a good explanation for that specific one at the moment. That's something we'll still look into to see what's going on there and try and capture that. But with all these ELCC values, they are kind of interdependent. So if something's off in the wind portfolio in December, that could change the other resources. But I'd expect it to be helpful, not hurtful. We do have at least one comment.
We have a hand raised from Perry Servideo. Go ahead, Perry.
Hey, this is Perry Servideo, CISA. I think I have two questions. The first one is if you could, your brain is in the modeling here and we're not, we're just kind of seeing this number from the outside. Could you help me better understand the distribution here across the months for the battery and what's really driving the percentage here? Is this mostly related to the forced outage rate, or is it related to any other type of energy limitation? Have you guys tried to make that a determination or comparison?
The forced outage rates in the model for the batteries at this point are uniform across the year. We ran those annually like we did in summer assessment. So that shouldn't be the driving factor. I suspect what's going on is the combination of the duration of the energy storage mixed with how wind, solar, and the load distributions are working out. I believe in the July, August, September, and June as well, and those periods are going to have a shorter total duration needed to meet load as best as possible compared to January, December, where it's going to be, the net load's going to be a little bit flatter, discharge over a longer period of time. That's obviously going to be impacted by dispatchable hydro, what it's able to do, and mix. But I think it's going to be based off of the demand placed on the battery.
Okay, and then just maybe to help round that thought out, I'm just wondering what, if anything, would change in these values if, say, the other resource classes were also following an average ELCC methodology. So if you added a thermal average ELCC into this, would these values go up, down, We don't know, or would they be the same?
I don't know. I'd just be guessing at this point. I probably wouldn't stay exactly the same, but I can't comment well on that.
It might be a helpful sensitivity to show that because that could highlight the impact of using two different accreditation methodologies across the resource types. That's to the extent that there would be a change. I'm not quite sure on the theoretical basis if there would be a change if you all of a sudden put the thermals in. But yeah, at least that could, having a sensitivity where you calculate the thermal average ELCC values and show how these have changed, could give us a good sense of whether using the varying accreditation methodologies has a big impact or whether they're pretty well aligned.
Okay, thank you. We'll take that into consideration.
Yeah, I think that was a comment that we had early on, and ensuring that even if you use different methodologies for different resource types, that the values are comparable so that procurement entities can make the valuable trade-offs between which resources they should procure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
The last slide I have is the draft planning reserve margin. Again, I want to emphasize this is based on the capacity that was included in the calibrated model. So these capacity numbers are what was included in the model, not what would be on the final qualifying capacity default list. And so you can see the model QC does go up in the summer months because you need more capacity in the summer months. It's lower in the winter months when we were able to pull out more gas capacity. The import amounts are based off of what we modeled in the summer assessment. I will note that the September import amount is slightly higher than the other summer months, and that's because we needed some additional import capacity to calibrate to the 22 events as opposed to the that we had previously. And those 1 and 2 peaks are, again, based off the median peak from the stochastic load distributions used in the model. They are relatively close to the CED peaks for each month, but as you'd expect, they are a little bit different because that 1 and 2 is based off of the annual peak. These percentages are a division of the modeled QC plus imports divided by that 1 and 2 peak. And I will note that the June ARM is where we saw most of the change, as well as September, but it was greater in June because we shifted some events from September. With that, I can go to questions.
You have a hand raised from Noah Tong. Go ahead, Noah.
Hear me?
I believe so.
Okay. Just wondering, did you take out thermals in September as well?
No, the capacity, we needed the entire thermal fleet that we had in the model in September, and then we added back in about 213. I don't remember what the number is right now. I'm remembering the wrong value, but it went from a 430 megawatt drop to about a 230 megawatt reduction on the normal limit that we'd have.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions at this time.
This is Aditya. I wanted to make a couple of comments here. And we've talked about this over the course of the day, but I wanted to say the PRM targets, if the numbers don't change after our investigation of the December values, these will be the final values. The monthly PRMs will land here, and then the counting rules for different resources will be based on the methodology. And the idea is the PRM and the counting values should be used together. Let's say we change the nature of work codes in the UCAP calculation, the UCAP values go up, which means the PRMs also will move up in the calibrated model. So they kind of go hand in hand in terms of how the application of the default rules and PRM should kind of work together. The other part I'm sure Ansel will touch here is because the comments arrived on Friday and we had less than 48 hours to kind of process and put them together in this deck, we focused on comments that we were trying to address, but there was a lot of positive support to the various elements of this proposal that were not highlighted here, but we do sincerely appreciate all of that input and support as well. Thanks. Parth, Ansel, back to you.
Thank you, Aditya and Mark. So Aditya covered the comments wrap up. I also wanted to acknowledge the California ISO Department of Market Monitoring submitted comments this morning. So we did receive those and we appreciate those coming in, and we'll be considering them as well. And with that, I'll hand it to Christina to check in on next steps.
Thanks, Ansel. Yeah, we just have a few items here to note for next steps. As a reminder, CAISO appreciates the robust stakeholder engagement and the multiple rounds of feedback we've received on the updates to the default counting rules and planning reserve margin, which will be applied in the ISO process only when not otherwise specified by the LRA. And we also wanted to check in on, we're requesting comments to provide any additional feedback by September 24th, 2025 via the comment template, which will be available on the initiative webpage. But we'd love to hear some thoughts if stakeholders are interested in providing comments for this round.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I think the intention is we're trying to get the proposal right, and we have had a lot of great input on the last paper from August. So obviously we've made some changes that we're sharing today based on the comments, and would be curious if stakeholders would be able to submit additional comments or if there would be interest for that. We will likely have the window open, but would just be curious to hear thoughts. And then, you know, the Board of Governors is, of course, based on where we feel we are with stakeholders and where the proposal is. So
Giving it a moment to see if there's any questions or comments. I see a hand raised from Perry. Go ahead, Perry Servedio.
This is Perry Servedio, CISA, one last time. Have you all given any consideration to delaying this board decision to perhaps December, just to give more time for the discussion on the natures of work that are intended to be included in the out the gate methodology? You know, it was good to engage with you all on it meaningfully today, now that we've seen, you know, sort of a written rationale there, and we really think that as others weigh in comments on that rationale and how that aligns with the selection of nature of work fields and ensuring logical consistency, that it may require, you know, another meeting. So to me, it seems that there's I mean, you know, the internal situation, but it just seems that there shouldn't be any rush to really get to the October board with that type of meaningful conversation still lingering out there.
thank you, Perry. I think we're considering the status of the discussions and the proposal right now, and so we'll take that into consideration as far as the timing. But Partha, did you want to add anything there?
No, just offering away, and yeah, I appreciate your feedback, Perry. We'll certainly be looking to think more about sort of the comments and feedback we received sort of coming out of this meeting. It's probably more of a matter of just certainly timing, but also a desire to you know, move this forward so that we have
a better default framework in place for stakeholders to look at. And I think it's like maybe a question of like, we recognize that there's probably a lot of elements that will continue to need over time. So maybe it's a question of like, you know, there's going to be significant progress versus our current results from now. Is there an iterative way that we can continue to evolve and get there? Or is it something that we need to basically put this on hold or make sure that we're sort of fully addressed before we go to the board for an update? So yeah, but yeah, certainly people will give it more thought.
Yeah, I really appreciate that part. I think if there's a rush for a board, it should be coupled with perhaps the opening of the parallel annual process to review the UCAP methodology or the QC methodology that can start, you know, immediately. But again, just on the need and the rush, I'm not seeing, you know, at least an external driver right now, as you guys have said in this call. You know, nobody's going to use these defaults. I think that's how you framed it up. So to that end, we know that the CPUC is moving on their default accreditations, I think targeting a 2028. So to me, I think, you know, it might make sense to just fine tune, take a little bit more time to fine tune some of these elements.
Yeah, that's fair feedback, Perry. I can certainly appreciate that perspective, and I think it's probably, yeah, that trade-off between, you know, what's fine tuning for these sort of for immediate use is kind of like the question. I think that we're recognizing the fact that there will likely need to be an iterative process over time, or we're continuing to fine tune it. You know, I think that, like, at least in all the markets, I think one of the lessons learned is that this is almost always something that people are really looking at in terms of the methodologies, what counting rules are working effectively or not. And that some of these, it might be the case where we want to spend a little more time on, but I think we'll go back and review the comments and consider that more, Perry. So yeah, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Partha.
Thank you, Perry. Next in the queue, we have Adeline Lasource. Go ahead, Adeline.
Yeah, hi. Conscious of people's time, I will echo what Perry said. I think definitely the UCAP portion, the nature of works, and I understand the discussion we had earlier. For you consider UCAP is the default, so everything related to the most of application or RAIM will be addressed in track 2. I think we want to have maybe more insight or information on how these will interplay, and I think that's a concern PG&E still have. I have so same thing. I don't think there is a rush to present that in the October Board of Governors meeting. Maybe 1 more month delay would also, you know, allow us to have time to discuss these interactions, which are very important for the principles and the problem statement we defined earlier in the working group process. That being said, I have also a complementary question. I saw there will be a MSC meeting on Friday. Are you planning to present some of these changes to the MSC? Are you seeking like an opinion before going to the board, to the MSC? That was the last question I have. Thank you.
Partha, are you able to comment on that question?
I don't believe that that's currently scope for the MSC discussion this Friday.
Thank you. And I'm not seeing any further questions at this time. So with that, we will move to close out this meeting. Now I just have a couple announcements before we wrap up for the day. Here are some meetings, comment deadlines, and trainings occurring this week. Here's some market simulation meetings from this week, along with a link to BPM updates. And lastly, for insights into the ISO grid and market operations, please be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can always subscribe. Here you can see our latest blog post regarding control center modernization and enhancing reliability. So with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's meeting. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. All meeting materials are available online, and the video file will be posted soon. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.